Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street partnered with businesses, organisations, unions and social democratic parties across the globe to develop community organising strategies and train leaders to build power from within their community. And in 2021, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories, inspire others, take action, give hope and organise communities for change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Socially Democratic is also presented to you by Morris Blackburn Lawyers. Are you passionate about providing access to justice? Morris Blackburn, Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, is looking for an associate to join their employment and industrial law team on a full-time, permanent basis. You will use your legal technical knowledge and expertise to strive for fair outcomes for their clients. The role is based in Melbourne, Victoria, and to apply, all you need to do is go to morrisblackburn.com.au/careers. Be part of change and fight for fair. Apply now. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast, out every Friday, that dives into the progressive campaigns and issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. It's the Melbourne Writers' Festival. It kicks off on September the 2nd or 3rd, I think, and runs through to the 12th of September. It obviously has now moved to an online festival because of the restrictions here in Victoria. But we thought we would get Zoe Daniel, friend of Dunn Street and the podcast, back on the show. You remember we had her on with a joint podcast with the McCall Institute where she was launching her latest book, Greetings from Trumpland, which is her account of the Trump administration whilst she was over in the United States as the ABC's Washington bureau chief from 2014 to 2019. Zoe's also had a wealth of experience as a journalist and a foreign correspondent with assignments in Africa and Southeast Asia. Obviously, there's been a lot of stuff going on in Afghanistan. She wrote a very interesting piece last week in the New Daily about the role of people on the ground living in Afghanistan or living in countries where journalists and diplomats and NGOs and foreign intelligence agencies rely on these people. And I just wanted to get Zoe on to talk a bit about that as well. So very interesting podcast. And please buy Zoe's book, Greetings from Trumpland, if you haven't already. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on Apple Podcast and Podchaser. For updates, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. And on a bit of a personal note, Senator Alex Gallagher, the Labor Senator for the great state of South Australia, passed away after a long battle with lung cancer. He passed away on Sunday, just gone. And I just wanted to say, a few words. Alex was my boss when I was a young organiser at the South Australian Northern Territory branch of the TWU. I remember my job interview with him. He and then his offsider took me for a boozy lunch at an Italian restaurant in Adelaide, and they said, "Stephen, we've done heaps of proper formal job interviews with people over a table, and every time we've done that, they've seemed really impressive, and then we've employed them and they've been shit. So we're going to do something different. We want to see someone in their natural environment. Do you like a drink?" And I said, "Yeah, I do actually. I don't mind a drink." And so for the next 4 hours, we proceeded to eat a lot of Italian food, drink a lot of red wine. I got actually quite pissed. And at the end of the lunch, I got the job. He said, "Well, this has worked out all right. You seem like a pretty good lad, so we're going to give you a start." And I worked for the TW for 4 or 5 years. And under Alex's leadership, I learned how to organise. It was a small branch. We didn't have a lot of resources. You kind of had to all muck in together. Like, we're all answering the phones. We're all helping out with the bookkeeping and taking receipts, and as well as negotiating EBAs and lodging them in the commission and organising and recruiting and all the other stuff that goes in between. And Alex, he ran a tight ship. We were a pretty successful branch. We had good membership, and we had plenty of money in the bank to look after our members. And Alex always made it very, very clear to me that the number one person in the TW were our members, and the people we have to look after. And he was a ferocious leader. He wasn't a perfect human being. None of us are. He was a grumpy bugger. And when he was grumpy, my God, didn't you know it? But over time, when you get to know the guy, he had a huge heart, and he was so loyal to his people and stood by you when you were having tough times. And I just want to pass on my condolences to Paula and the family. He'll be missed. He was a rock. The Labor movement has lost a giant this week, and wherever he's gone, whether you're a person of faith, I'm sure he's up in heaven now playing a round of golf, or if you're not a person of faith, I don't know where people go, but I just wanted to take this opportunity to pay my respects to a great Labor leader in Alex Gallagher. Rest in peace. Okay, let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Tuesday morning in locked down Melbourne, and my guest today was the ABC's Washington bureau chief from 2014 to 2019 and has had other assignments as a foreign correspondent in Africa and Southeast Asia. She's a journalist and author. Her latest book is Greetings from Trumpland. Zoe Daniel, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thanks for having me.
Lots to get through today, and originally I kind of wanted to get you on the show because of the Melbourne Writers' Festival, but obviously because of the lockdown restrictions here in Melbourne, that's been put on hold. But I will ask you some questions later on about your book. But the events in Afghanistan in the last couple of weeks has been terrible timing. But since you're on, I really want to kind of pick your brain, since you've got a bit of experience being a foreign correspondent with the ABC for a number of years. Starting with the withdrawal itself, the Biden administration's come under a bit of criticism in the manner in which they've handled the United States military withdrawal from the country. Was that criticism warranted, do you think?
Look, I think it's the manner in which the withdrawal was executed as opposed to the withdrawal itself. I think it wouldn't have mattered whether Donald Trump won the election or whether Biden won. The withdrawal was going to happen. And we know that Donald Trump was on the record saying that he was going to withdraw from Afghanistan and probably would have done it even earlier. So, I think there's broad support in the US for getting out of global wars. And certainly that's something that Donald Trump was able to mobilise to his advantage in terms of political support during his administration. So from that perspective, no surprise that Biden did seek to execute the pullout. The thing is that the US, but not only the US, the world has been completely blindsided by the capacity of the Taliban to move into the breach as soon as that withdrawal began. And I don't think it's just governments. I mean, even NGOs who were working in Afghanistan failed to get their staff out, not reading the fact that the Taliban was going to be capable of doing what we've now seen play out. These things are always very easy to criticise in hindsight, I guess, especially when you see these horrifying, almost live images of what's playing out at the airport, for example, in Kabul. But even with that, I think that the broader US population will support the withdrawal. The question is just how much blowback there is in the longer term on the administration around the way that's been done, to what degree that's read as a policy failure and a failure of execution and planning.
Did you catch the comments by that former CIA counterterrorism official, Phil Mudd, which is a shocking name, on CNN? He was on Jake Tapper over the weekend, and his argument was that any movement by the US military in terms of the US forces pulling out of Kabul would lead to a surge by the Taliban, and that he had predicted that the minute you start to deconstruct things like at the airport or withdraw or burn papers or any of those kind of indications, then the Taliban would surge, the Afghan government's forces would fold. And he sort of put back to Jake Tapper, you give me a better plan than what was executed by the US military. What did you make of those remarks?
Well, I think, that's been a sort of common refrain. I've seen comments along those lines from several people that you would describe as experts, sort of putting forward the position that it doesn't matter when you did it, it was always going to be disastrous. But, even with that, I think that the problem that Biden has is that he came in a COVID crisis as the calm set of hands, the adult in the room after a particularly chaotic period of American politics, if we could call it that. And then sort of as soon as he stepped out of COVID into something else, it's a large-scale disaster on international television. So, even people who in the States who wouldn't have put Afghanistan in their sort of top 10 issues of concern are suddenly watching this play out on TV and have a view about the way that it's been executed. So from that perspective, it becomes a political problem for the Biden administration. And framing it in that way, I don't seek to in any way put on the shelf the humanitarian disaster that it is and will become. It's going to get a lot worse for the people of Afghanistan before it gets better, unfortunately. And by the time that happens, the eyes of the global media and public will have moved on. And that's what I sort of find particularly tragic in the context of the 24-hour news cycle that we have now. Nothing stays in the public eye for very long. So judgments will be made about US intelligence, the fact that they should have done better, they should have had a better read on the Taliban's capacity, how quickly things would surge, what they needed to put in place in order to get people out fast enough in the face of that, how they could slow that down, all those sorts of questions. But, at the end of the day, international influence will have largely been withdrawn from Afghanistan, and then the people of Afghanistan will be left to fend for themselves without a lot of international oversight of what's going on, obviously, because anyone who could get out will have left.
That humanitarian crisis and those people that are left on the ground once all of the international diplomats and agencies leave. You wrote a really fascinating piece in the New Daily last week, and I recommend our listeners to go check it out, talking about the important role locals in countries like Afghanistan play for diplomats and intelligence officers and journalists. Talk to us about the role that those locals, which you refer to as fixers, I'd never heard of this term before, play in terms of supporting you as a foreign correspondent in a place like Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, it was a reflection on the reality of life for international journalists, and there are some synergies in the way that journalists, the military and diplomatic staff work in a country like Afghanistan, where, you cannot arrive in a place like that and work effectively without local support. And in the world of foreign correspondent land, those people are referred to as fixers, and they're in effect producers, cultural advisors, translators, in many ways sort of security, whereby they will help you to navigate the place in which you arrive, where you have limited cultural understanding, limited understanding of where the dangers are, perhaps limited language capacity and all those sorts of things. So, these people are integral to the work of correspondents, the military and diplomats, and also NGOs in these sorts of environments. So you cannot work effectively there without very good local support. And, obviously I've worked all over the world as a journalist in lots of difficult places. And, there's a sort of a mantra in journalism that a foreign correspondent is only as good as their fixer. The fixer is the one who's going to get you to where you need to be, who's going to get you the interview that you need to get, but who is also going to keep you safe in doing that? Who's going to warn you that, local militias have been active in this area in the last few days, or, there are particular cultural parameters that need to be observed in this environment? That's where the expertise is filtered from the local people through to the foreigner, to enable, in my case, information flow and storytelling to the world, which is important. But these people put themselves at huge risk to do this. And one thing that foreign journalists who work in difficult environments always bear in mind is that it's the local fixer who's vastly more at risk than the correspondent. I mean, plainly, international camera crews face risks when you're working in a combat zone or a conflict environment, physical risks. You face potentially the risk of arrest. You could face the risk of being disappeared. More than likely, though, you'll face the risk of deportation if you're working in a country where you're not meant to be. And this is something that I've done a lot of, working undercover in places like Burma, Myanmar, before Vietnam, Zimbabwe. But the fixer will stay there. And then they need to keep their head down for the rest of their life. They need to keep themselves and their families safe for the rest of their life. And if they're picked up by the authorities, they very possibly could be killed or put in jail or disappeared forever. So the risk parameters are far higher for those people than they are generally for the foreigners who are there. And that was what the piece was about, that sort of synergy between the work of Correspondence and the work of other foreigners in a place like Afghanistan, where at the end of the day, the foreigners leave and the locals are still left there, and that's their life.
What drives them to take these risks, to play these roles, to support the work of journalists such as yourselves?
Look, most often it's a sense of wanting to make a contribution to the future of their country. So, in the case of somewhere like Zimbabwe or Myanmar, places where I've worked a lot, or Vietnam, generally the fixer is trying to support the reporter or the media to get a story out that wouldn't otherwise be told. So to shine a light on something. There is a degree of opportunism as well, in the sense that when foreign media or the military or diplomats seek to work with a local person, the wages, salary conditions will be vastly higher in general than what that person will be paid doing anything else in that country. But people who have the skills, particularly the ability to deal with Westerners, which can be quite difficult, and also the language skills, often will step into that for the sake of what they can contribute. And they become close friends, valued colleagues, an integral part of teams. And, in that sense, well, like everyone, I watched what was happening in Afghanistan at the airport with absolute horror, but also in the back of my mind thinking of those soldiers, those diplomats, those journalists and others who had worked in Afghanistan very closely with people who were watching those scenes at the airport thinking, is my colleague in that crowd trying to get out, and what can I do for that person? And, we've seen several articles written and a lot of pleas made by those who have worked extensively in Afghanistan, trying to advocate for the various foreign governments to value the work and the risks that these people have taken in order to try to evacuate them before they either can't get out or they're hurt or killed because of the support that they've provided to foreign media and military and governments.
And that's a critical word there, that in your remarks there, what value do foreign governments place on these people? I mean, I'm obviously completely biased as a Labor Party person. This is a Labor Party podcast, or a left-wing podcast, but I just got really frustrated at the Morrison government's initial inaction to move quickly to support not just Australian citizens that are working in Afghanistan, but also the good people, the equivalent of the fixers that were supporting our journalists our defence forces and our government and NGOs as well. I mean, the least we can do is get them on a plane and bring them back. I think the most we can do is actually parade them down the main streets of Brisbane, Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane and celebrate them for the work that they've done, because they've given so much support to the work of Australian citizens in a place like Afghanistan. And, I'm all for, hawk policy, foreign policy, but you've got to back up those people that have gone into a fight with you as well. I think it's pretty gutless to then just sort of leave them behind. What was your take on the Morrison government's approach to this when we sort of suddenly realised, oh shit, this is going to happen quicker than we actually expect? Did they move quick enough, or do you think that they were a bit slow?
Well, I think they were a bit slow, but I don't think they were alone in that. I think, everyone was caught, as I previously said, completely blindsided by the speed at which things unfolded. I mean, again, if you were to rewind it, you would say, before we do it, we need to think, well, what is our process of evacuating people? And I'm sure some thought was put into that, but plainly the thought was not adequate. I guess my question would be, not to be cynical, but would it have been any different with a Labor government in power? The same logistical issues stand, which is that the airport was a huge security risk, and actually landing and taking off and getting people through that bottleneck was incredibly difficult. And the thing is that governments the world over, especially the US and Australia, among others, have form on this. I mean, there are translators and security staff and all sorts of people who have worked for foreign forces, if you like, in Afghanistan over the years, who've then spent years mired in bureaucracy trying to get themselves and their families out because of, various red tape and particular immigration and refugee policies. So, I guess it's easy to level criticism, and not to say that I don't, because, I'm appalled by how it's been handled. I'm just not necessarily convinced that flipping the politics to the opposition would have made any difference given the logistics.
It's funny you mentioned that. I had an Uber driver during the second Victorian lockdown. I was going to the physio, and he was from Afghanistan, and he was a translator for the Australian Defence Forces. He was on a temporary visa, and he was trying to get his family out, and he was finding it incredibly difficult. But it was quite a long journey, and actually that in itself could have been, I was thinking, this is a great podcast. This guy's fascinating. Him telling me the stories of the experiences he went through. But it was the first time I'd really actually considered the plight of people such as this that are on the ground in these countries. You're right. It's something that, a Labor or Conservative government has to do better.
Well, and I think it has made me sort of go through a process of self-examination over the last couple of weeks. I have worked with fixers in many places who have been at risk. And I mean, in the article that you mentioned, I referenced one incident when I was in Vietnam working with a very young female fixer. We went and visited the family of a human rights lawyer who had been arrested and in effect disappeared for supporting dissidents. And we were then tailed by the secret police, and we had to drop her off in the back street of Hanoi in the middle of the night so that she could evaporate in order to not get arrested. I mean, in another case, I worked with a fixer in Zimbabwe who was arrested, and then we had to go through a process with the Zimbabwean police, in effect, to get him out. And in the end, he managed to get himself out with some support from us to South Africa and became, in effect, an undocumented migrant in Johannesburg. But, if you're a journalist or one of the other categories that we've talked about who's worked with someone in Afghanistan and you're trying to get that person out, you begin to realise just how completely powerless you are to help the person who has done so much to not only augment, but really to make your work fly. And I note that, the ABC team that has done a lot of recent work in Afghanistan in regard to the behaviour of Australian soldiers has been working very hard to try to get the fixer or journalist out who they've been working with great difficulty. Because even if that fixer or staff member has a visa, getting to the airport and through that chaos with absolutely no sense of law and order, really, other than being eventually sort of pulled through a gate, potentially by a Marine, is very difficult and dangerous. And to try to execute that and coordinate that from here is really hard. And I know that there are people here who've worked with people there who've been working really hard behind the scenes to try to get these people evacuated, and are incredibly concerned and tearing their hair out, because trying to work through that process across the seas is not easy.
Turning our attention to writing, the Melbourne Writers Festival is on starting on the 3rd of September, running through to the 12th. Obviously, because of the restrictions, it's changed to an online format. I know that you were originally scheduled to present to it, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to get you on the show. But we can talk about writing anyway. You finished a book just recently called Greetings from Trumpland, which is a reflection on your time over in the United States. And we did a podcast in conjunction with the McCall Institute a while back with yourself. So you should go back and check that out. And I hope the sales of the book are going through the roof. I wanted to sort of talk to you about the process of writing a book such as this. As an Australian author and journalist, I get the feeling that there is less coming out these days about politics and current or public affairs than there were maybe 10, 15 years ago. I could be completely wrong there. Maybe I'm not going, we don't have borders anymore, so I'm not sort of wandering through that section as often as I would have. But is it getting harder for writers to craft long-form written pieces such as essays or books on politics and current affairs in Australia?
Look, I think that, well, firstly, Australia is a very small market for books. And if you're an Australian writer, be it of fiction or non-fiction, you don't write a book expecting to kind of make money or a living out of it, really. And there are a few notable exceptions. Obviously, if you write a fictional bestseller, then that's great. But it remains rare. I think particularly during the era of COVID, and this is documented, that people are gravitating less to that sort of political book because people are looking for lighter, more escapist reading that takes them away from the day-to-day of news, current affairs, and general sort of downward trajectory of everything. So, non-fiction has struggled over the last 2 years. But to my mind, I feel just in myself that this is part of a broader trend, in the sense that there's so much available to us online. We are now bombarded with content, and much as print media organisations clearly have struggled in the last decade or so, in many ways, people are reading more content than ever. They're just getting it differently. So, when you've got access to so much long-form content online and so many long articles and, a lot of different sources and perspectives, perhaps the need to go out and buy a particular book, that is detailing a particular thing over 100,000 words is lower. And also just sort of more of a social observation in that sense. I feel like attention spans are quite skinny now. And the 24-hour news cycle illustrates that too. People tend to focus on the shiny thing or the crazy thing that's going on for sort of 24 to 48 hours, and then it passes very quickly, which, brings us back to something like Afghanistan, or before that, Myanmar. What's going on in Myanmar now? It was getting so much attention 6 months ago, now completely off the radar, and what's changed? Why are we no longer focused on that? It's very hard to sustain public interest in detail. And I think that then reflects on sort of nuanced political writing, if you like.
I used to think that was a millennial problem, that they didn't have the attention span for more than 20 seconds. I was watching a TV show that we just started last night, and I just realised within about maybe 5 minutes that the characters weren't grabbing me, and I'd picked up my phone and I was now flicking through Twitter. I was like, oh my God, this is everyone. It's shocking. And also sitting down to read a book, you probably do read, like on a Saturday, I might, there'll be like 3 or 4 kind of go-to pieces that I will want to read on a Saturday morning. And I'm doing that more often now than I probably would have done 10 years ago, and less likely to actually physically pick up a book and say, right, okay, the next 2 hours of today and then 2 hours of thereafter, I'm going to go through this book. I know plenty of people still doing that themselves, but I'm finding that very, very difficult.
Yes, well, even reading an entire newspaper, because you don't receive the entire newspaper, you're just cherry picking what you want to read off the various websites. So the way in which we consume has changed. And again, I think that reflects back onto nonfiction, and, the numbers will show, especially during COVID, that people are gravitating towards, as I said, more escapist, either fiction or things like autobiographies and those sorts of things that tell inspiring stories.
You decided to write a book. Why did you decide to write Greetings from Trumpland and put it actually into a physically bound book as opposed to some other form of communication about your thoughts and your observations of the Trump era? What were the barriers in going about doing that?
Look, I think that Greetings from Trumpland is a book that's about context and, speaking to the sort of level of detail that people are prepared to consume in terms of their daily news appetite. That was a particularly crazy period, obviously, that sort of 4 or 5 years. And there was a lot that was lost in terms of who Donald Trump supporters were and who they are, and why they were and are supporting him or that particular agenda. But also just to try to tie a web together of the impact that Trump's various words and actions had over that time. And so there was a sense of there's more that needs to be said. And again, it's not the kind of book that you write thinking, well, I'm going to make $1 million out of this, but it's kind of a book that you write thinking, if someone picks this book up in 5 years and reads it, they'll go, oh, that's what happened. So it kind of helps that penny to drop. And it's interesting. I mean, I did an interview with Virginia Trioli about the book, and she said exactly that. Like, I feel like this book is the record that when you pick it up in a few years' time and have a chance to actually look back at the Trump era with some perspective, then you actually get a much deeper understanding of what happened. And the thing is that it's not only about Donald Trump in many ways. It's about populism. It's about the growth of that kind of politics the world over, and also implications for places like Australia of that type of politics.
I'm going to... I was going to save the questions for US politics till the end, but I actually want to bring him in now since we are talking about it, and I can't resist. And I'm going to go backwards. Trump, where do you think Trump is right now? Do we see him running again for the presidency in 2024? And what are you looking at as key indicators to suggest whether that is the case or
not? Well, firstly, yes. And I mean, my own email traffic, because I'm signed up to various Trump mailing lists, if you like, has escalated substantially in the last 4 weeks. So you see a lot of fundraising, a lot more back and forth from the Trump campaign team, if you like. I mean, I think that it's sort of almost accepted by many commentators in the US now that he will run in 2024. Things can always change, but right at this moment, I do think that's his intention. And I think that, if you look at the polling, he still has very substantial support, more than substantial support. And also, with a couple of exceptions, not a lot of competitors who would sort of threaten his position when you compare it to the support base that he has. I mean, we know that he has that sort of rock solid base of about 35%. And so it's a question of what else he can build. Can he drag other people across? But the bigger question for me is who Biden can keep or who the Democrats can keep. I mean, I think if we assume that Biden won't run in 2024, then that becomes a question about who the candidate is and whether that person can threaten Trump. So there's sort of a lot of variables in there. But, for Biden, I've always sort of felt that the risk was that he would come into a COVID crisis. He would put all his energy in trying to solve that. And that has, happened to some degree. Like they've certainly made great strides on the vaccine program and such. But it's a question of, does that travel? Does that last from 2021 to 2024, that goodwill around COVID? And what happens in the intervening period in regard to the economy, largely? Because one thing that I learned from traveling around, 44 states in my time in the US was that most people vote based on what's in their hip pocket, and not in a cynical way, but it's so tied to their hopes, their dreams, their aspirations, their confidence, and their sense of their children's future, that if the economy is flagging and jobs aren't growing, that's when people start to look elsewhere. So it's a very interesting dynamic. The midterms will be a really key indicator. I would only say, though, that I find the midterms a lot harder to read than the presidential election, just because people vote so much more locally, obviously, in midterms, that it's a lot harder to find a trend.
And history has shown, certainly in recent years, that the midterms have been a disaster for the incumbents that have 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. So it doesn't look great for the Democrats going into the midterms. But at the same time, it's such a weird vibe about American politics right now that I find it hard to get a handle on where things will go. Like, I think from a Democrat standpoint, because they lost the election in 2016 to Trump, that he's almost like this. He has like a mental fix over their hopes and aspirations and their electoral outcomes. But in reality, if you look at the results on the board, he won the 2016 election, but then lost the House of Representatives at the midterms, lost the presidential 2020, lost the Senate in a runoff as well. Not even just sort of happened in the chaos of election day. It actually was a pointed election. So there's been, since Trump was elected, there's been 1, 2, 3 opportunities for American voters to reject him, and they've done that.
But I think that it's important to say that the midterms, as you say, often swing against the incumbent. So we keep that on the table. And the presidential election happened in a COVID pandemic. And see, I would still say that as of the start of 2020, Trump was walking into a second term. He only lost it because he lost control of the narrative because of COVID. The question is, does that travel through till the end of 2024? And, how motivated are Democrats? Because obviously Democrats were very motivated at the end of 2020 for good reason. Do they stay that motivated through till the end of 2024? And the thing is that what you say is dead right, except Trump's still not dead. like he still has a huge presence there, and that's fascinating.
Looking at the Republican Party, I really thought that Mitch McConnell and co would use the January 6th insurrection as their moment to rid the party of Donald Trump and set the party in a new direction. And I use the term moderates for Mitch McConnell because I don't think he is, but that's how crazy the Republican Party's got, that you look at Mitch McConnell and think he's a moderate, for them to regain their own party again, the grand old party. They really missed that chance. They blinked. What's your read on that? Was that wise of McConnell, or do you think that he's playing the long game? Like, what was the reasoning behind his decisions to not go hard at that opportunity?
They just need Trump, and they know they need him. I mean, it's a big cohort, and they haven't figured out a way of keeping that cohort in the tent without Trump. So they sort of half-heartedly renounced Trump after January 6th. But then by the time we got to the CPAC conference, I think it was in March, they were starting to fall back in behind Trump to some degree. So, they're trying to kind of have their cake and eat it, the Republicans. They want to keep those Trump supporters, but they want to keep the moderates as well. And it's very hard to keep those two groups in the same tent. The Democrats have, issues as well in terms of the broadening of their base, the sort of inner city hipster, climate change focused professional set versus the blue collar union workers who would have been, the heart and soul of the Democrats previously, who are now drifting to the GOP. You've got a lot of sort of social and economic demographic change happening there, and also the changes brought about by immigration that are having a huge impact on who votes for who. So it's very interesting. But, in terms of not renouncing Trump, I mean, I just think it's as cynical as they know they need him. So they can't sort of afford to put him aside. The only thing they can do is to try to engineer him out by coming up with an alternative candidate like a DeSantis, for example, who people will get behind because he's sort of Trump light, if you like, and whether you could keep Trump sort of behind the GOP in some way on a joint ticket or something like that. But, I mean, Trump he wants to be the front man always. So it will be very difficult to find a compromise position with him, of course.
It's been a couple of years now since you returned home to Australia. Do you miss the cut and thrust of being over in the US and reporting on US politics?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, listen, it's a great privilege to have a job where you're right in the front of history, like literally unfolding 2 feet from you, be it in the Oval Office or at a Trump rally, or, when Hillary Clinton's being announced for the nomination, or whatever it might be. And there's something about working in the US, particularly that the bigness of it is very sort of pervasive when you're there. There is a sense of sort of being in the centre of something. And I think that was particularly the case during the Trump administration, relentless as that was, trying to keep up with it as a reporter. There was a sense of just sort of being pulled along by the momentum of something, and very much being in sort of a historic turning point in a sense. And I, much as what happened on January 6th and the pandemic and everything seemed like a turning point, I feel like we're not out of that turning point yet. I feel like we're sort of still in that vortex, and I'm just not quite sure how it's going to pop out at the end quite yet. There's quite a long distance between 2021 and 2024. A lot can happen. And I remember, it's weird, Stephen, but I said to a few people at the start of 2020. Well, the only thing that will stop Trump winning will be a massive disaster of some sort, like a world-changing event. And in my mind, I was thinking of a large-scale terrorist attack or a huge earthquake in California or something like that, that those sorts of cataclysmic events tend to change everything. And it came in the form of a pandemic.
Yeah, and you know, there's so many things that I want to ask you about that, but I know we need to wrap up. But you're right. I mean, it is such a long time between now and the next presidential election. My God, the days between election day and actually, inauguration literally felt like it was 6 years, and even the last 18 months has just been, as you say, it's a time vortex, and I don't know where it's going. Greetings from Trumpland by Zoe Daniel. You should. Listeners out there, if you haven't bought it already, please go and buy it. It's a fantastic book, and as Zoe said, it is a moment in time that you'll look back and read on it and go, "My God, I completely forgot how insane that Trump years were." So please go to a good bookstore and pick it up. Zoe, thanks very much for your time today and coming on the show. Best of luck with your work going forward, and we'd like to get you back on the show again. Maybe when we get closer to the midterms next year.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.